Hey students, in Unit 1.4a, we will be focusing on taxes and how they impact the market and its stakeholders. Taxes have a significant effect on markets because they alter product prices by creating a wedge between the amount consumers pay and the amount sellers receive. This in turn prevents market equilibrium from being achieved, leading to inefficiency in the market. Taxes can be divided into two categories: direct taxes on people and their income, and indirect or excise taxes on expenditure. Excise taxes are levied on specific goods and services such as gasoline or wine. The model of supply and demand illustrated earlier and the concepts of consumer and producer surplus are used to identify the potential inefficiencies associated with taxes, but we'll discuss in more detail later. It should be highlighted that because an indirect tax is a tax on expenditures, it can be imposed on the expenditure from firms and households. When households buy goods and services, otherwise known as consumption, in the product market, it's called consumption. And when firms purchase factors of production in the resource market, it's called investment spending. Indirect taxes can be levied against the investment expenditure of firms as well as the consumption expenditure of households. Because of this, an indirect tax in the business sector adds an extra cost to the producer. Therefore, it forces a leftward shift of the supply curve, as the following model illustrates. As you can see in the model, an indirect tax is placed on top of the selling price, hence raising the product's price and reducing the quantity demanded. The reason for the tax shifting supply instead of demand is simple. It comes down to the statutory incidence. The statutory incidence, or burden, of a tax refers to which party has the legal obligation to pay the tax. For example, the incidence of sales tax on many products is on business firms because the seller is legally responsible for collecting the tax and sending the money to the government. As a consumer, you may feel that you are the one who actually pays the tax because the amount is added to the price when you make your purchases, and this leads us to consider the economic burden of a tax. The economic incidence, or burden, typically differs from the statutory incidence. Often, consumers bear at least part of the economic burden of taxes in the form of higher prices of goods and services. Economic analysis is used to predict what percentage of the economic burden of the tax falls on buyers and what percentage falls on sellers. The answer, as we will see, depends on elasticities of demand and supply. So simply put, the tax incidence is a measure of the consequences of a tax on all the affected parties, like the producers, consumers, and the government who receives the tax revenue. Tax impacts the profitability of any product, of which the degree may vary. Whoever pays the tax suffers the tax burden or has the greater tax incidence, as we refer to it in economics. An excise tax can be a per-unit flat or specific tax, which is a fixed amount of tax per unit of the good or service sold. For example, a $5 per pack of cigarettes would be an excise or flat tax. Because of this, a flat or specific tax will cause a parallel shift in the supply curve. This is because the marginal cost of selling the cigarettes is taxed at a fixed price of $5, regardless of quantity. This means no matter what the price at any given quantity sold, the tax will be an additional $5 per unit. Or an excise tax could also be what's called an ad valorem tax. Ad valorem, which means according to value, and is an indirect tax, which is expressed as a fixed percentage of the sales price. So with an ad valorem tax, as sales price increases, so too does the value of the tax. For example, the sales tax in some Texas cities is 8.25% of the price of taxable commodities. The taxed supply line diverges from the original, as 8.25% of a sales price of 200 units will be much greater than a sales price of 20 units. For emphasis, a tax will lead toward an increase in price. Taxes shift supply to the left, which raises the equilibrium price of the product. As shown, due to the statutory incidence of tax falling on the firm, supply shifts from S1 to S2, leading to a rise in price as supply becomes more scarce. An increase in tax also reduces the output of the firm, as a greater percentage of the revenue is going to the government instead of being reinvested into the production process or invested into research and development to make production cheaper in the long run. Decreases in the supply raises the equilibrium price from P1 to P2, which then in turn decreases quantity demanded as the increase in opportunity cost associated with consumption rises from Q1 to Q2. Taxes also tend to shrink the market in the short run. Remember that the statutory incidence falls on the firm. This means while producers and consumers both contribute to the cost of the tax, firms are legally required to pay it to the government. This creates a higher opportunity cost for doing business as the tax increases the cost of each product sold, ceteris paribus. As a consequence, there will be a decrease in supply, which in turn causes an increase in the equilibrium price from P1 to P2 in the model. The higher price causes a contraction in the quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. This contraction in market size might pose an unemployment problem, as the most efficient way firms can adjust for incidence of tax is usually to lay off workers. While the firm has the statutory incidence, the economic incidence of tax can be distributed amongst the firms and household sectors by increasing the price of the firm's products. The producer, usually, does not pass the entire tax burden to the consumer. Why is this the case? Well, the producer realizes that an increase in the price will result in reduced quantity demanded, which is the law of demand, as their consumers will look for cheaper substitutes and will be less willing and able to purchase your product, thereby diminishing the firm's revenue. Because of this, the tax is usually subdivided into two parts: the consumer's incidence and the producer's incidence of tax. Remember consumer and producer surplus from our unit on the price mechanism and market efficiency? Well, let's analyze how a tax makes the market function more inefficiently and how the tax affects producer and consumer surplus. When the government levies a tax, consumers suffer as consumers pay higher prices and receive less of the product. As we can see in the model, prior to the tax being levied, consumers enjoy a large surplus, represented in the area in red, when purchasing Q amounts of the product at P prices. However, after a tax is introduced, a new price that consumers pay is set at PC, where the tax supply line intersects the demand curve. As a result of this higher price due to the implementation of the tax, quantity demanded falls from Q to QT as opportunity cost of the consumption of this product rises. The green area represents the consumer's incidence of tax, while the brown triangle represents the loss of consumer surplus as consumers pay higher prices for lower quantities. Producers also suffer from a tax as producers incur extra costs, produce less, and are less likely to make profits or revenue. Here, in a free market situation, producers obtain maximum profit, producer surplus, when selling Q amounts of their product at P prices. Producer surplus, i.e. their profits, are represented by the green triangle, while a combination of the green and pink triangles form the revenue box. Don't forget the difference between revenue and profit. But let's just focus on how a tax impacts producer surplus for a bit. After a tax is levied in the market, as shown from S to S taxed, consumers are unwilling to purchase QT amounts of the product producers at original P prices. So producers must lower their quantity supplied, lower the supply in the market from Q to QT in order to avoid producing a surplus of their product, which will lead to market inefficiency and wasted production for the producer, which also means wasted financial investments. This also means in order to maximize their profits, producers must lower the price of their product to keep customers interested in purchasing QT amounts of the products. So the price producers receive for selling the products falls from P to PP. The orange box represents producer tax incidence, while the red triangle represents the loss to producer surplus following the tax. So in order to maximize their profits, represented by the surplus in green, producers must lower the quantity supplied to QT. The only beneficiary of a tax in the immediate short run is government, as the tax collected will increase government revenue. So let's break this down step by step. Here we have a free market situation where equilibrium is reached and producer and consumers are benefiting equally from their market interaction. When the government decides to impose a tax, because of the statutory incidence, the producer is legally responsible for paying the tax, consequently shifting the supply curve from S to S taxed, while increasing the opportunity cost of investment for the firm, thereby diminishing supply. As a consequence, the supply becomes more scarce, leading to a rise in the price so as to avoid a shortage and market inefficiency. Due to the rise in price from P to PC, consumers are less willing and able to purchase the good at QE. So, quantity demanded falls to QT for quantity taxed, ceteris paribus. Remember on the model that consumer surplus is defined as the area above the price line and below the demand line. Because the tax increases the price of the product the firm is willing to sell to the consumers, consumer surplus shrinks to the area in blue as consumers have to purchase a smaller quantity at a greater price, which translates into increasing opportunity cost for the consumption of this product. PC is the price that consumers must pay because the producer is also somewhat responsible for paying the value of the tax. Producer surplus will decline as well. As producer surplus is defined as the area below the price and above the supply line, because the price the producer receives has changed, so too has the producer surplus or the producer's profits. The yellow box represents consumer incidence of tax, and the red box represents the producer incidence of tax. So combined together to make the tan box, which represents overall government revenue whose value can be determined by calculating the area of the square. PC minus PP times quantity taxed is equal to government revenue. The yellow triangle represents the loss to consumer surplus, and the red triangle represents the loss to producer surplus, which combined together are referred to as deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the loss of welfare, utility, profit, or benefit to make participants, typically as a result of taxes, protectionist policies, or externalities. The deadweight loss of the tax will depend upon two factors: the size of the tax and the reduction in the quantity sold. The reduction in the quantity sold will depend upon the elasticity of demand and supply. The more elastic demand or supply is, the larger the deadweight loss will be. If either demand or supply is price inelastic, then the deadweight loss will be small and could be zero if perfectly inelastic. When price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply are similar, consumers and producers share the burden of tax equally. Consumers pay more and receive less output. Consumers and producers' surplus declines, and the market size is reduced from QE to Q taxed. What happens to the consumer and producer tax burdens when demand is inelastic versus elastic? When price elasticity of demand is greater than price elasticity of supply, consumers are more responsive to price and therefore less tolerant of price increases. Producers pay more of the burden of the tax because of this. Government receives less revenue. Market size decreases quite significantly, therefore employment is more likely to decline. Deadweight loss is greater due to the large decrease in quantity from QE to Q taxed. When price elasticity of demand is less than price elasticity of supply, consumers are relatively indifferent to price changes. Consumers' tax burden is greater than producers. Why? Because inelastic demand, tends to mean that you're addicted to it, or you need the product to survive, something like this. As a result, governments receive more revenue. Market size decreases relatively little, therefore employment is less affected. Deadweight loss, however, is smaller. Deadweight loss also is smaller. For example, when a specific tax is levied on petrol or gasoline, consumers will have the greater tax incidence, as gasoline is usually a necessity for transportation and commuting. As a result, deadweight loss is minimized as consumers bear the brunt of the tax burden. The more elastic the demand relative to supply, the greater the burden paid by producers, the greater the deadweight loss, and the smaller the government revenue. So if the government wants to maximize its revenue from the tax, they will tax inelastic goods. The more inelastic the demand relative to supply, the greater the burden paid by consumers, the smaller the deadweight loss, and the greater the government revenue.